Greetings, I am Tartarus, and welcome to the second of the Archivist lessons. Today's subject is the basics of humanity. Now, this could be a rather broad subject, but I would like to break it down into smaller, more easily digestible segments, such as what would make them unique compared to any other fantasy worlds humans are different from us, then discuss a little bit about their cultures, specifically aspects. You may remember that at the end of the last video that I mentioned aspects. It may have seemed completely out of place, but however they are a sort of pseudo-religious cultural phenomenon within humans in this world. This is due to their magics, but more on that later. Right now I would like to discuss what is far easier. More like the physiology of these humans and what you can expect to be looking at. In the core of Tavora, where the bulk of humanity resides, most of the people you would see would have pale skin, but a variety of eye and hair colors. The skin would just be due to the climate in which most humans evolved in, which would have been very unpleasant, somewhat comparable to England, with grey skies, very, very prevalent heavy rainfall, and then the time underground would have done them no favours in that regard as well. There are some humans with darker skins that have resided in the southern wastes for some time. These are nomadic people that don't often integrate into Tavoran society and prefer to stay in their corner. Other than that, they are going to be tall, muscular, and very reminiscent of just one of us. Though their magic is what makes them quite special. In this world, magic is somewhat related to your genetics, in that some races are predisposed to using a particular kind of magic. However, there are others that can be predisposed on an individual case. This I frequently describe as having an affinity towards one specific aspect. From birth, you are going to have this affinity both towards the personality and the magic of this aspect, whatever it has been assigned to, and if you try to deviate from this path by using another aspect's magic, you're going to find quite a bit of difficulty in utilizing and learning that aspect's magic. This isn't due to the fact there is some sort of mystic mental block or the aspects interfere with those that have an affinity towards another. It's simply just a natural, born, intrinsic value of the race. It's a counterbalance because there are others, such as the Tiquo, which are naturally born with an inclination to light magic. It doesn't matter if you're going to be highly magical or slightly well-inclined to magic. You're going to be able to use it in some capacity if you are a Tiquo at some point in your life. This makes them quite dangerous, as you might imagine, as every warrior would have access to magic himself, as would every priest, or every dedicated mage. Now, the Tiquo are a little bit more complex than that, but in talking about humans, some of them might not have the capacity to muster so much as a fireball. Meanwhile, you might have someone with Aphora's tendency to be able to predict disaster. Some of these magics are not going to be quite so flashy and quite so useful when you need to obliterate some sort of charging beast. But knowing all of this, you might be asking yourself, exactly what is an aspect? I've been using that term a lot, and it's not going to be equivalent to a god, and that's because aspects are more of a deified concept. I've mentioned the story of Elira in the previous video and how she was a real woman. That was no myth. There's quite literally proof in the world that she existed. Now, why would you have that as an aspect? Well, she was quite influential to humans, but the idea of aspects came more from the Pirov. The Pirov had a system of divinity, but the humans were not directly involved nor exposed to it. They, of course, could not attend any sort of spiritual ceremony, being slaves. So they did take the idea of some sort of divine entity, but they didn't have a broad picture of it. And they didn't also have a lot of time to develop any sort of fear of lightning or any sort of very, very primal idea of the elements. So instead they replaced it with things that did have significance in their society, this being someone that would have caused an uprising and freed their race indirectly, being Elira. Or when they followed the star home, it was Tauren, who had some cultural significance before humanity was enslaved. But all the same, they did have some more universal ones, such as Finor, the aspect of death, and there were also very, very enigmatic ones, such as Aphora, which is the aspect of fortune and disaster. That's a very broad one that would need its own video to discuss exactly what she encompasses. but know that aspects are more so of this grouping of ideas assigned to a type of magic. Elira is the aspect of fire, compassion, and love. Of course, some people will attribute more words to that, some of them synonymous. So those that use fire magic, or magic that invokes several emotions, panic, fear, calm, that's going to be Elira's magic, and is therefore considered Elira's fire. She's also taken on some more symbology, such as being attributed to the sun in the sky. Some people will address the sun as Elira herself. Of course, this is not going to be something as they believe she ascended to have become the sun. There's no such prevalence of that in the story or any of the cultural notes that I have written down. But little ideas like these combine with creeds, covenants, and bonds within people that form a larger culture that are attributed to the aspect's faith. Now, this isn't truly faith in some cases. You don't need to believe that Elira existed for her to have actually existed. But faith is the easiest word that I can utilize here. And as you might imagine, these core beliefs on how someone should carry themselves, how they should live, and how society should be run is the main reason for division among humans now. These aspects have formed entire cultures and have entire armies behind them in most cases now, not so much the minor aspects. But now we can break down these different factions. Firstly, let's discuss Tauren and his associated magic, Tauren's Light. These were the individuals that fought in the front lines during the devastation. They wielded magics that could imbue their blades with the power to cut through demons, ignoring their physical resistance, and seal their wounds, preventing regeneration. They also had powers to imbue their allies with light that would deflect the enemy's blows, but beyond that, they are more noble and have a high respect for vigilance. Vigilance was actually one of the main tenets of Tauren during the devastation, that you should never let your guard down, for the demonic scourge could be around the next corner. Which is a rather kind way to tell you that the demonic scourge was attacking at random at any time of the day or night, and was this restless force that just showed up in overwhelming numbers and would wipe cities to nothingness. Now, the concepts of vigilance and standing against that which is vile, and altruism and personal sacrifice, martyrdom, these are words you might commonly associate with paladins and their ilk in other fantasy worlds. Though the followers of Tauren are less there to spread his word and more so to do their duty. They were pretty much the sole barrier against the darkness, and they took this seriously, especially in the early days. In fact, after the devastation, when these tenets were a little bit more loosely defined and some of the newer generations didn't respect them as much, this is where you had schisms with people like House Tiergo. House Tiergo you might be familiar with if you've seen my social media posts, but they are traditionalists in the eyes of Tauren. They believe that even though the scourge is banished, that their job is not yet done, and that anything less than actively hunting and pursuing these vile creatures is a failure to Tauren and a failure as a person. And to see the source of this harsh creed, we can turn to the book for a reading from page 150. Bodies cast around in halves, scorched lines of Tauren's magic on the ground. Some had set up shield walls, just to be trampled and overwhelmed. Others had made an effort to help the wounded, only to be taken down themselves, their hands still entrapped together. A few in the center had given up, died in the embrace of another, until their arms went slack and cold. It was draining to look upon, until a dim light sparked to life again. It flashed into sight atop a mound of charred demon bodies, as if to draw his eyes to it. The greatsword, encrusted by charred flesh, seemed to balk at his presence with its enchantment. The wielder was just nearby, further up the throne of corpses. Dul shuddered to look upon him, his final defiance a message that had even parted the horde. As the man had collapsed from his many wounds, he had held out an amulet of Tauren over the edge of the wall. The silver effigy of the star still dangled, sparkling in tandem with the sword it once sat beside. Just that, by its chain, unleashed a burst of magic that forced him to step back. Its blazing radiance caused the nearby impure demon flesh to sizzle and bubble, daring another to step towards him or his comrades. Even knowing the danger, he could not help but linger and stare. There was such power in his proclamation, his refusal to succumb to anything more than his death. His end was on his terms, a bitter stubbornness that humanity would not be defeated. But that was an ominous promise. That light of hope beckoned forth its own darkness, that many more good men were to die. These men sacrificed everything, marching under darkened skies against an inhuman foe that they did not know had an end. At the time of the devastation, they were led by one of the most brilliant men that humanity had ever known, a man known by the name Kressel. There are many locations now named after him. He was one of the few that could unite all of the different ideologies within humanity under one banner and direct them against the demonic. Some historians would later point out that the existential crisis may have been one of the greatest reasons for Kressel having success in this manner. But yet the man was a brilliant tactician in the way he commanded his military, the way he listened to his people, and many of his speeches to this day are still remembered from just how earth-shattering they were, and how they shook the souls of his people and rallied them against the demons. But it is from these origins that you should be able to see that they would be a society that would emphasize military might, meritocracy, and protecting their people. The preservation of the farmer was one of their core tenets in the old days because of the fact that an army marches on its stomach. Their fortresses, the mighty barrier cities I have mentioned, combined both a military fortification and production of farmland, just due to the necessity of feeding this many soldiers. And yet at the same time, it was this baseline autonomy that the farmers granted them, along with their standing military, that after the devastation led them to seek independence and governance on their own. The distance from La Salle Bastion was quite great, and it seemed like the chain of command had been completely severed to them, especially with how far along the frontier some of them had gone. And now they maintained the control of the core lands the Urobor once possessed. These reclaimed areas had mighty barrier cities, which offered them a base of operations to expand, gain more timber, form towns, expand farmland, and overall form a very functional society. Their current leader is Everlam Starskin, who you will see mentioned in the novel several times, who commands several sections, which are an equivalent to about a US military division. I will unfortunately avoid going into too much detail about the sections now, as they are quite critical to world building and a bit about the plot which may see use in the second book. That, and I will also avoid going through their ranks, as information that's that tedious would probably be best reserved for a video on its own. For now, an understanding of Tauren's followers as a noble warrior collective that hopes to keep the peace and preserve humanity will serve you well enough. And now to move on to Elira. I've already told the story previously in another video about the woman Elira, but what of the faction that she spawned? Well, in the early days, when humanity had first broken free, not many had really considered her an aspect. Rather, she was just an influential figure. Most people were concerned with Tauren. This is because Tauren was where most of humanity's military strength lied. They needed protection in this new and uncertain world, and Tauren and his followers provided that. The zealots, however, of Elira would come during the devastation. In this difficult time, people would cling to ideology more than most other things. And later on, after a few decades had passed and humanity pushed into the west, they would find a site with strange fragmented stone that had been burnt and glassed over. Now, initial investigations during a demonic invasion were of course quite difficult. However, there were stirrings and rumors that this was the very site of Elira's immolation. No one could of course prove this, but it was enough that the people that believed in Elira's story, that wanted to make something of it, came to this land. And as the devastation would come to a close, these people would create the city of Cinderstone. Cinderstone would be one of humanity's largest cities, its most secretive, and the foundation for the faith itself. That is because the most zealous that created this place would attract more and more followers to it. They would hear the word, and they would become believers themselves. This proliferation would spread all throughout the north, leading to the modern control you see today. A great deal of this aspect's rapid spread can be attributed to the universal nature of its message. Elira forsook relative safety and certainty to go out and reunite with her lover, even if it meant battling against insurmountable odds. Her commitment, sacrifice, and most importantly, power, were what left an impression on people. Power that was not wielded for evil, not for wickedness. Power that was used to reunite and reforge that which should not be broken. To Elira's followers, there is no greater offense than to defile true love between a man and a woman. Of course, the faith has grown to encompass a little more than that now, teaching others to love themselves as they are, despite imperfections. Preaching unity, as community and bonds of friendship nourish the mind, body, and soul. They wish all to know the joy Elira did, and to never know the agony of her ultimatum. However, they are anything but soft. To the north they have the Beastlands, which provides frequent contact with all manner of creatures, and the ogres. Having such belligerent neighbors forms a strong people, who find higher purpose within the chambers of Elira. The most fervent, dedicated, and effective individuals will find themselves formally inducted into the faith, with the opportunity to ascend to the very tops, that being the feared chamber guard and the dreaded night witches, depending on if you are a man or woman. The lower ranks, however, start off very informal and loose. They are locally moderated by either a flame tongue or a soul caller, people of middle rank who will oftentimes lead a chamber, one of the local places of worship, which will be the core of one of the towns or just farmsteads. But even those of a middle rank, such as a flame tongue, are expected to be exemplars and bringers of Elira's word. In times of crisis, they are expected to rally the local people, form militias, and defend towns and cities against incursions from those such as the ogres, and even handle smaller incidents such as belligerent trolls. Over time, this made it commonplace for those outside the faith to find themselves fighting alongside those within it. This would be individual adventurers that lived in the north that, while not members of the faith, would simply find their homes threatened by ogres and fighting along against a common foe. This has grown quite prosperous for both parties, as individuals could find work and trade within the faith. In more recent times, adventurers have almost become contractors, the mutual respect for each other allowing prosperity along the frontier. This is also extended to the Ostorans, who never fully committed to any one single human aspect. But due to their dislike for urban environments, or just densely populated areas, they once more find themselves in the north. Ostorans have frequently worked with the faith as scouts and surveyors, being some of the finest outdoorsmen in all Tavora. However, not all outsiders are treated with such respect. The faith refers to all those outside as bound. Bound to desire, bound to hate, bound to tarnish the word of Elira. You can prove yourself otherwise, but if you indeed misstep once in the north, punishment is swift and severe. Small crimes are usually reconciled with beatings, but a crime against the faith is no small ordeal. Dare so much as to kill once, destroying a bond of pure love, and it matters not how far you go or where. A night witch's blade is now your inevitable end. And there you have it, Elira's faithful and their magic of Elira's heart. Followers are the one that made the ultimate sacrifice, now rising as a prominent force in Tavora. Their ranks swell with warriors and mages, zealots who bathe themselves in righteous fire, armed with the finest weapons humanity has made. I would most certainly like to explore this faction more, for within Cinderstone and their upper ranks there are many secrets and many more worthy stories. Onto Orbex, Aspect of Madness. Orbex is a very strange one, nothing like Tamriel's Sheogorath. He's something far more primal, born from humanity's strife. When the Purov Antiquo raided and gathered humans, there were some who left the Lasal Bastion. They went northwest, in similar areas to the Ostorans. These were particularly hardy people, quite stubborn, but plainly. They were the last of their kind to avoid capture, and that was due to Orbex. Representing the early interactions of humanity with their own magics, Orbex was born from a desire for power that could keep humanity free. But this was born of a desperate people in a most difficult time. Any solution would do, the cost be damned. Oribex's touch would make a single man worth 20, and doom him to a crazed, bloody death. For he grants wild strength, the bewildering ability for mortal flesh to rend metal barehanded. And then he gives that which takes. Deathlust. This phenomenon is inevitable. These unstable magics can seldom be controlled, once beckoned forth, their duration and potency unknown. Deathlust then comes and amplifies this, both the unpredictable strength and the time of the effect. It also takes the mind of the affected for its own. Consumed by mania, Oribex's followers obliterate anything that moves, be it friend, foe, or a branch waving in the wind. The only two fates that remain are the death of the follower or everything else surrounding them. The only exception is when they are led by a veteran and survivor, who may give them some form of guidance when they are blessed. Now, the nature of Oribex in his story is well explained through a notable antagonist in the novel, and I would not want to ruin that for anyone. I'm quite a fan of his nature, as he is almost more of a philosophical sort of aspect. For those of you curious about the mad aspect, look forward to Chapter 8, though the novel itself is full of this greatly influential yet shunned aspect. Then Ilia. Ilia's breath is both the name of the aspect's magic and seen as the very stuff of life itself. She also represents discipline, being one of the aspects with a very clear divide within her domain. Recall that I said you might be bound to your aspect's personality. Ilia is a prime example. Those born to Ilia belong to one of her two sides. Firstly are those who have an uncanny control over their body, performing feats of athleticism and endurance no others can, be it holding their breath for hours, leaping across a chasm, or even stopping their own heart temporarily. These people are of an eccentric cut. They are often wild and sporadic, unpredictable and with a short fuse. They are thought to be of Ilia's untamed side, nature's unbridled power. Then there are those that are wise, slow, and passive. These will be those who can cast her healing magics. They will be kind, with a tendency for introspection. Those with an extreme affinity can bring even the most sick or wounded creature back from the brink of death with their touch. But to be born to Ilia is uncommon on either side. With Tavora being an unforgiving and unrelenting land, all of Ilia's children find themselves in high demand. They are all well respected, both in their local communities and abroad, though they have no formal structure, and in fact refuse it. Instead they find themselves as local heroes, with her healers often forsaking fame and fortune. And for anyone, they are irreplaceable. At most, one will find a place of veneration where some followers have gathered, referred to as a sanctuary of Ilia. Not as imposing or fancy as Elira's chambers or Torrent's chapels, they are often a collection of gardens and houses, and places for peace and healing. But what of fate and death? Humans indeed covered both of these. Alok is sometimes called the trickster aspect, but is most often referred to as the aspect of fate. His magic is Alok's theatre, a domain covering all manner of sensory manipulations. Those with his affinity can turn invisible, distort or create sounds, blind or deafen their enemies, and create illusions. It is for this reason that thieves and malcontents look to Alok, but luckily most of his followers are scholars. This is the main trait of those born with his affinity: curiosity, a yearning for knowledge and a vision of history. Many with an affinity to him end up as archivists and adventurers, concerning themselves with discovering and recording the past and present rather than the squabbles between others. However, it is of note that Cinderstone finds this to be quite important as well, having great underground vaults dedicated to collecting and gathering relics and deciphering what texts survived the devastation. For this reason, they have one of the largest groups of Alok's followers in the land. And much like Ilya, they are rather informal. Most of his followers will have strange trinkets, and libraries or archives will have a carved statue of a faceless man. But beyond that, Alok has no place of worship. For he is everything and nothing, his power drawn from the world itself. The one who knows the fate of all souls, and when the world will end. Upon his theatre, all dance for him, until the curtain comes to fall. Finor, however, strictly has domain over death itself. Finor was perhaps the most uncommon aspect to be born to before the devastation, and by the end of it, no one seems to be born with his affinity. This has worried some that Finor was in some way damaged or lost during the devastation, further reinforced by the fact that undead have become a constant threat since then. This is not seen as Finor's anger, but rather his absence, for he was never an evil aspect. He was necessary, and the right hand of Alok. There are many scholars dedicated to studying Finor, to further understand him and the state of the world. But yes, this aspect would have allowed manipulation of souls with its magic, this being the ability to raise or banish undead, or rip someone's essence apart with a thrust of a finger. With this and Orabrex, you may finally begin to see how humanity happened upon demonic magics. Lastly, Aphora, and the magic of Aphora's fortune. Aphora is thankfully another uncommon aspect to be born to. With a slight inclination towards magic and Aphora, you'd be able to sense storms some time before they show. You might even be able to predict what the weather will be like when you wake up in the morning. But that scales up. With a great affinity to her, you'll be accurately predicting horrible earthquakes, tornadoes, intense blizzards, or even when a season is going to be particularly bad. And from this has come the belief that it isn't prediction, but summoning. And those with Aphora's affinity are the cause for disaster. This is not the case everywhere, but in places that hold this belief, you'd be chased out the third time you accidentally let it slip that it's going to rain. Those that instead listen to those with Aphora's blessing prosper, as preparation against disaster can change the fate of an entire township. Some of these places may even allow a small shrine as a place for their protector to rest and meditate. But that is about as much as is allowed. Aphora is not one many like to speak of. And, as a fun fact at the end, Aphora may be the aspect of disaster, but she has no domain over famine or disease. She may cause famine through her natural processes, but that's just seen as a result of her power. Anyways, that covers the basics of humanity's aspects. I had to cut a lot of it down, but what was omitted will find itself in dedicated videos. For now, the second of the Archivist lessons can come to a close. I have been Tartarus. Thank you for stopping by.